Culture of the High Middle Ages. Our objectives are: 1. Discuss how an intellectual revival led to the formation of universities. And 2, explain how in the High Middle Ages new technical innovations made it possible to build Gothic cathedrals, which are one of the greatest artistic triumphs of this age. Now first, let's begin with the rise of the university. Really, the university is the kind of culminating image of what the medieval period has to offer, transitioning into the modern era. And it's really, even in some senses, a tangible glimpse at the heritage of what our society has really come from. The university, as we know it, is a product of the High Middle Ages. And really, the kind of idea of university is kind of like a corporation or a guild. I mean, you look at the concept of guilds in the medieval period, where apprentices would go to study a particular craft, like blacksmithing or shoemaking, and they would learn from masters. And this was the kind of concept, except more heady, more abstract, that they would learn mathematics and astronomy and so forth through masters of those fields. So you can think of university, or this kind of school in an abstract sense, as a kind of guild. Now, the first universities kind of cropped up in Italy, and Bologna first. Particularly, the most famous teacher of the time was Irenaeus, who taught Roman law. And, of course, this attracted many students. And it's interesting because Roman law was so dominant since the Roman period as really the universal law of Western Europe. I mean, nothing else had really been articulated. And it's interesting, too, that because of Latin, which is kind of that universal binding language, you would have people from all over Europe, no matter what language they speak, from Germany to England or wherever, coming and learning the law, but speaking Latin altogether. That's why really Latin ends up being and maintaining to be really the central language of learning in Western Europe for so long, up into the modern era. And of course, rich princes would want to send their pupils or their whoever that they wanted to learn Roman law so that they could bring it back and they could apply it to their kingdom. Now, in the 12th century, a number of students and masters left several universities, Paris, for example, and started their own university at Oxford, England. So we start seeing the spread of these universities, and some of these major universities have their lineage, have their connection all the way back to this medieval period. Now, what was taught in these universities? I mean, what was taught looks much different than what you and I might study at university. Largely, you had a liberal arts curriculum, and that is a course of study. And the curriculum included grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy. You can kind of see that they're all kind of mathematical based. There's no real history or language arts or something like that. Now, the rhetoric is actually a really important one, and it's kind of lost art these days in terms of lots of study. It was the major study for a lot of people. I mean, you do get it through communication studies, but the whole idea was persuasive speaking, persuasive speech, because this was such a central tool to be used in politics. Now, the method that people learned through was lecture. Now, it's not the kind of lecture that you're enduring now or that you might endure in class. Lecture, in our sense, is you sit there and you listen to a teacher speak and explain things to you. But really, lecture, coming from the Latin word lectare, means to read. And so the professor would sit there and read the book to the students. You think your classes are boring. Now, of course, for them, it was not boring because you know what? No one has books at this time. Very few people have books. Books are so expensive in this age. Maybe even as expensive as we might spend on cars in some cases. So professors read these books to their students, and the students then took notes or various other activities that they tried to master and understand. Now, how it worked was that there was one oral examination that completed your Bachelor of Arts. How would you like that? One test at the end of your entire schooling, and it was oral. If you messed up here, you didn't graduate. After that, of course, you had other options, a Master's of Arts, right, an MA. But there were only 3 options at this time: law, medicine, or theology. Now, of course, you can imagine that these 3 would be quite popular, particularly law. But theology really was an important study. Theology really is the study of religion and God, and it was really the queen of the sciences. And it was quite complex, studying ancient texts and ancient writers to try to illuminate and understand the ineffable God. I mean, that's quite an abstract image, and so it was quite popular, particularly in a Christian society. However, we see over time a shift away from just pure religious analysis and toward the exploration of other philosophic minds. So theology was most highly regarded, of course, right, in medieval universities, but as we see a gradual introduction of Greco-Roman philosophers, particularly Greek philosophers like Aristotle, we see a sort of tension begin to emerge. And this tension has to be married together. And this tension is really married together in a movement called Scholasticism. Scholasticism tried to reconcile faith and reason. It tried to harmonize Christian teaching, Christian theology, and Greek philosophy, trying to take the writings of Aristotle, whom did not really speak about God or anything like that, but he wrote on everything else pretty much, and kind of harmonizing him with the theological texts of Christian antiquity. Now, of course, for our modern minds, there seems to be no conflict. But if you could imagine as a medieval Christian, someone saying, hey, we should read this, right? He's a pagan. He doesn't believe in God, right? He's a polytheist. Most Christian thinkers of the time would think this quite preposterous and ridiculous. What in the world does a polytheist pagan have to do with us? And so this is going to be a major battle and shift. Now, Aristotle's works, of course, as I said, upset many Christian theologians, right? Because he explains the universe without God. Now, it doesn't mean he's atheist. He certainly isn't. He just focuses on physical causation of events through observation, kind of like what we would see today in our scientific thought, right? So he's searching for causes or reasons for things happening rather than the divine, right? There is a storm. Well, the storm was caused by something other than God's, right? So you kind of almost end up having this conflict of rational thought versus faith. That's not quite true, but that's how you might first initially kind of think about it. That you have this Greco-Roman philosophy versus this kind of faith issue. Now, really, in the 13th century, St. Thomas Aquinas kind of reconciled Aristotle with Christian doctrine. And Aristotle, of course, has a different rubric with which to analyze things, and Christian doctrine does as well. So St. Thomas Aquinas says, you know what? If this stuff is true, then this stuff is true, right? And so these things can certainly marry. Now, what's fascinating about St. Thomas Aquinas is he asks questions and tries to prove them as true without the use of divine scripture. Right, this was huge, a huge shift. It's so different than anything that had really come before. So when he asked the question, does God exist? Right, the typical response was always, well, let's see what the Bible has to say. But here, Thomas Aquinas ends up exploring the question, does God exist, in a sort of Aristotelian way, by analyzing it in a philosophic sense through observation and through the world around us. And so this is a major shift. This is a question that really Aristotle didn't necessarily kind of explore. So the question itself is somewhat Christian anyways. But he's using an Aristotelian method by which to get to it. And so really Thomas Aquinas is the marrying of these two. So it was really embodied then an attempt to reconcile the knowledge learned through the Bible and other Christian writings with the knowledge learned through reason and experience, that is, the divine and the human existential kind of life and experience that people have. So the human mind, unaided by faith, could use reason to arrive at truth. This was ultimately Thomas Aquinas' big revelation, right? You can come at the truth without faith. You can come at the truth without the Scripture. This is, of course, would mirror an argument that Paul makes in Romans, right? That we see the universe around us and that we can see that the divine existed. Right? Whether you agree with that or not, that's not the point. The point is that this is the answer that Aquinas and other Christian thinkers have kind of arrived at when you have this kind of tension and conflict over whether there is a clash between reason and faith. Now, at the same time, we end up seeing a shift away, or at least in addition to, Latin literature. Latin was the universal language of medieval civilization in terms of writing. Peasant people spoke their own vernacular, no question. All right, but in terms of writing, it was always in Latin. But new literature during this phase really began to crop up in those vernacular kind of languages. Now, vernacular is the language of everyday speech in a particular region. There are a couple different examples of this, of course. Troubadour poetry, that is songs and poems, usually associated with crusades and things like that, written in French. You have the Dagi, heroic epics, and the Chanson de Geste, I guess, pronouncing it in English, heroic epics like the Song of Roland, for example. The Song of Roland is an epic story, kind of capturing, though not necessarily historically accurate, the adventures of Charlemagne stopping the Muslim invasion at the Battle of Tours. Charlemagne wasn't there, but nevertheless, that was a major kind of shift in telling these things in French and so forth. Now, we'll see, of course, that shift later when we talk about Dante and we talk about Chaucer and so forth. But for now, that's really where we're at. And we also see architecture, shifts in architecture, which was our second objective. In the 11th and 12th centuries, we see a massive change begin to occur in architecture. We see a shift from rectangular buildings with flat wooden stone roofs, which was really the Romanesque style, and we see a shift away from that to a new elegant and elevated and quite mathematical form. And this new style is called Gothic, which brought vaulted ceilings and high windows. Really, some of this stuff was even dependent upon the reintroduction of Euclid's geometry. So we see kind of a shift back into some of this ancient knowledge as it's applied to building monumental architecture. And so some of these flying buttresses and beautiful, huge cathedrals are quite beautiful and are really the hallmark of medieval architecture. If you go to Europe and you see medieval architecture, most people will want to go to these Gothic cathedrals because of their grandiose beauty. Now, our objectives then, 1, discuss how an intellectual revival led to the formation of universities, and 2, explain how in the High Middle Ages new technical innovations made it possible to build Gothic cathedrals, which are one of the great artistic triumphs of this age.